CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen. And
I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Ukrainian President Zelensky describes his phone call with China's President Xi Jinping as long and meaningful and has appointed a new ambassador to Beijing.
Our other headlines, thousands of people are evacuated from Sudan, where an uneasy ceasefire seems to be holding.
First Republic Bank shares fall 50% after it reports a dramatic slump in deposits. We'll be in Wall Street to assess the wider consequences.
And it's Electric Avenue, why EV sales are bringing about an historic transformation of the car manufacturing industry.
China's President Xi Jinping and his Ukrainian counterpart have been speaking by phone. Volodymyr Zelensky described the call as long and meaningful.
President Xi reassured President Zelensky that Beijing would not add fuel to the fire, saying the foundation of China's relations with Kyiv is mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Beijing also announced it will send special representatives to Ukraine and hold talks with all parties aimed at resolving the conflict.
This phone conversation shows the great importance China attaches to growing its relations with Ukraine and China's willingness to maintain the momentum of cooperation in all fields. Second, since the full escalation of the Ukraine crisis, China, as a responsible major country and a permanent member of the UN Security Council, has been committed to promoting peace talks in an objective and impartial manner and has stayed in communication with relevant parties.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent Shelby Wilder in Kyiv. Shelby, what more do we know about President Zelensky's phone call with President Xi?
Well, Ukraine's government had repeatedly reached out to the Chinese government, hoping to hold these discussions between the two leaders. And now that it's happened, we are hearing these positive remarks from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, saying that phone call with President Xi was, quote, long and meaningful, end quote. Now, the two leaders discussed the conflict, but also Ukraine's appointment of an ambassador to China today. And President Zelensky said that this call with the Chinese leader would likely boost bilateral relations with Beijing.
So what does all of this mean for the possibility of the start of any peace process or peace talks?
Yes, well, President Xi confirmed to President Zelensky in that call today that China would be sending a special delegation to Ukraine to hold peace talks. And President Xi appeared to claim that China would remain neutral in the conflict, saying that Beijing didn't want to add fuel to the fire or that they didn't want to profit from this crisis and this situation. Now, we know that separately China unveiled its own 12-point peace plan earlier this year on February 24th, which marked the one-year anniversary of the conflict. But Beijing has continued to call for a ceasefire and peace talks between Russia and Ukraine.
Let's just put the diplomacy to one side and talk about the latest on the fighting.
Yes, so the latest we are hearing from Ukrainian intelligence is that they have seen Russia's military now taking up defensive positions along the front lines. That's apart from the city of Bakhmut and the surrounding areas in the Donetsk region. But otherwise, Ukraine's intelligence believes that Russia will now be trying to hold on to its territorial gains, its occupied territory in eastern Ukraine, rather than trying to make a new push or gains, as it's believed that Ukraine is now starting its highly anticipated spring counter-offensive, Jamie.
Shelby, thank you for that. Our correspondent Shelby Wilder with the picture from Ukraine.
Thank you.
Well, let's get some perspective from Russia. Our correspondent Stuart Smith reports from Moscow.
Well, the Russian Foreign Ministry said it has seen and appreciates the call from China to the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. It says that it appreciates the efforts of China in the search for peace in Ukraine. But the Foreign Ministry reiterated it believes the ultimate reason peace talks have not begun are due to the stance of Kiev and also what the Foreign Ministry described as Western curators. Having said that, the Kremlin for a few months now has been quite transparent in that it says the conditions aren't ripe for negotiations at the moment, and therefore the special military operation, as it's known, would have to continue until its aims are achieved.
Meanwhile, Stuart, President Putin has signed a decree to take control of some foreign assets in Russia.
Yeah, that's right. The energy companies, the state-owned energy companies of Finland and Germany, Fortum and Uniper, they have assets in Russia, power stations, as well as wind and solar farms, which now the Kremlin is saying have come under mandatory management of the Russian government. To be clear, the Kremlin says they still own these assets to the tune of about $1.8 billion US, but in response to the actions of what the Kremlin calls the aggressive actions of unfriendly countries, they'll now come under Russian management. This is part of a scheme which the central bank hinted at last month, which is that it's trying to find a way to get the European Union, the United States and other Western nations to give back Russia's frozen reserves, and through these kinds of hostage-taking of firms, in a sense, this could be a path to begin negotiations on freeing up funds at both ends. And so the Kremlin seems to want to hold on to these assets until such negotiations can resume. Finland and Germany say they're still looking into the details. The companies themselves as well say they're investigating what this means in practice, but Finland has already said it's a worrying development.
And also, several Russian planes have been intercepted. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, 3 Russian planes over the Baltic Sea. It's a part of NATO efforts that these planes were identified and also photographed by the German Air Force in conjunction with the British Air Force. They're there as part of a NATO operation to protect Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia. They spotted these aircraft with their transponders turned off. No suggestion from Germany this is a part of any broader threat. In fact, these flights are quite common, reportedly, because Russian pilots fly from the Russian mainland to Kaliningrad, that exclave in Europe. So no threat from this, but another reminder that there's a lot of military activity happening to the north of Europe, even though there's no fighting going on there.
A ceasefire between rival military factions in Sudan appears to be holding despite gunfire and explosions on the outskirts of the capital, Khartoum.
The first flight carrying British nationals escaping Sudan has just landed in the UK. They're among thousands of people who've been airlifted from the country. Meanwhile, Sudan's Interior Ministry has accused the RSF paramilitary group of breaking into 5 prisons and releasing all the detainees. But the RSF has denied the allegation.
Well, our correspondent Patrick Oyert is in Juba. Patrick, what more do we know about these alleged prison breaks?
Yeah, what we know is that 5 prisons have actually been broken into. That basically means there is no one now in Khartoum in any prison. All the inmates are out, they are at large. And of course, one of the prisons, Koba prison, is one where former President Omar al-Bashir has been. And of course, the family has said when this fighting began, he was not there. He was at a military hospital, and that's where he remains. And also that prison had a number of his former government officials, including, of course, Ahmed Harun, who is actually wanted at ICC for crimes against humanity and war crimes that were committed in Darfur. He was a minister for Interior at that time. He is out of prison as well. And also it is a worry for many of the Sudanese people, especially Khartoum residents, because these are some of the criminals who are in and now they are out. They could still continue to even create some problems because it's not a small number. We are hearing of thousands of prisoners who have gotten out. And of course, the 2 fighting forces are accusing each other. The Sudan Armed Forces is accusing the Rapid Support Forces, and Rapid Support Forces is saying it is the Sudan Armed Forces that released those prisoners.
Patrick, reports of gunfire and explosions heard on the outskirts of Khartoum. What's your information? Do you sense the ceasefire however uneasy, is holding at the moment. I think we may have lost the line to Patrick Oyet. That's a shame, but I think we got the gist of what he was reporting on the prison breaks. We may try to return to him a little later in the programme, but in the meantime, our thanks to our correspondent Patrick Oyet in Juba.
Well, let's talk now to Iman Abu Gaga, who's a British Sudanese doctor who managed to flee Sudan and arrived in the UK today with the help of the French embassy. And she's joining us from Manchester. Good to see you. Thank you for talking to us on what's clearly been an enormously busy day for you arriving back in the UK from Sudan. How did you find yourself in Sudan in the first place?
I was visiting family. Went for the end of Ramadan, celebrate professional achievement, and to attend the Eid celebrations.
And while you were there, how close was the fighting to where you were in Sudan?
At our doorstep. The shelling was all around us, the bullets in our house, so it was very close.
So obviously incredibly scary, and you knew you wanted to get out.
I did want to get out. And my children were there as well, so it was very harrowing.
So you obviously found yourself there for a period of time before you were able to leave. What was the situation like?
It was dire. I was at the airport. I was going to go for a few days to perform a pilgrimage in Mecca, and when the shelling and the shooting started, it started in the airport, or well, that was one of the points where they started. And I had to make a very difficult decision as to what I was going to do now. So I escaped from the airport and crossed the road amidst gunfire, took shelter at my aunt's house, and then the next day I walked from my aunt's house, which is a considerable difference, to the family home to be with the children and my parents, who were all sheltering together, including my sister who lives in her own home and my brother who lives in his own home with his children. And at one point there were 12 people in the house. The house was big enough, there was space, but we were running out of supplies because of the power cuts in that temperature. The food started to go bad, the freezers were melting, and we knew that it was not a situation that was safe anymore. So found myself evacuating from the airport, evacuating from my aunt's house, and then now evacuating from my parents' house. And we went and stayed. There were 6 households in my sister's home, and we managed to get by, but at some point it was getting difficult. We had no cash to buy supplies. The banking apps weren't working, so you'd go to the grocery store and you wouldn't be able to buy the necessities you need. We tried to remain as positive as possible, just try to keep our spirits up and shelter when the missiles fell.
But obviously, sorry to interrupt you. Obviously, through this time, you wanted to leave. How did that come about in the end?
So we registered with the Foreign Office, and we kept getting email alerts every day stating that the government doesn't yet have a plan, and just general advice on what to do in warfare, shelter, don't go out, things like that. My son is an Irish citizen, and on the Sunday morning he received a message to go to the French embassy. So I knew that I had to get him and his younger sister out. So we drove them there and managed to get them into the embassy. When we arrived at the embassy, there was a gentleman being carried in on a mattress. He was severely injured. And I told the soldier at the door, I'm a doctor, do you guys need any help? And he just ushered me in. Once inside the embassy, I spoke to the consul and said to him, I'm here to bring my children, but I'm going to leave now. And he said, no, you don't have to. You're a British citizen. You can stay. So it was a massive, massive relief. It was very kind of them.
Clearly an enormously difficult experience. How are your family doing now?
Not too good. We'd gone in addition to everything I mentioned earlier because my father is ailing. He's not well. And at the moment, we have left the most vulnerable behind. Everybody we have left behind is suffering from one or other medical condition. And it is just the most heartbreaking decision I've had to make in my life.
Well, we wish you and your family all the best, and thank you so much indeed for sharing your experience with us today. That's Iman Abu Garga, who fled Sudan and has arrived back in the UK today.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Heathrow Airport was the busiest airport in Europe in the first quarter of this year. So why isn't the company back in the black?
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and the bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. First Republic Bank stock went into free fall as the markets opened on Wednesday, hitting a record low after plunging 50%.
It's managed to pare back some of those losses, but the future of the bank is still on rather shaky ground.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett, who's in New York. So, John, before we start talking about First Republic Bank, we've had some breaking news within the last few minutes, because Disney says it's suing the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis. So what can you tell us?
Yes, I know. It's all happening here on Wall Street, I'll tell you. Look, in very, very simple terms, OK, Disney World in Orlando, Florida, is much more than the theme parks, OK? It's a 50-square-kilometer area that Disney for years has completely run. They run the roads, they run the schools, they run the municipal, the whole thing, OK? Now, Ron DeSantis, who is the governor of Florida and a likely candidate for the Republicans in the 2024 presidential election, at least the early stages of that, he thinks Disney is too woke, okay? Now, they may or may not be, doesn't matter. The point is he thinks they are, okay? And that is because Disney challenged one of his laws, which we know here as the Don't Say Gay law. Doesn't matter what it is, it's just a fact, okay? So Ron DeSantis tried using legal maneuvers to take Disney's ability to control this 50-kilometer area away from them. At the last minute, almost secretly but not quite, Disney turned the tables on Ron DeSantis and stopped him from doing so, using local bylaws and stuff like that. And now the whole thing is going to be wrapped up in the courts for years to come. And now in the last 17 minutes, we've noticed that Disney has filed suit in court, and they're going a stage further. They are now suing Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, for interfering in their business and trying to destroy it. So that's the latest news, and we've only just found out about this in the last 15 minutes or so. Disney shares in the green, I notice, but only by a little bit.
Well, they might be in the green, but First Republic stocks are completely the opposite, because their stocks had to be halted briefly today.
I know. Well, they did. This was yesterday, Tuesday. They were halted briefly. And something I don't really properly understand here happened. When they gave us their earnings on Monday night, they beat on the top and the bottom line, OK, so that's good. But they let it be known that deposits at the bank were down massively. And everybody was running around the floor here saying, oh, it's $72 billion, $72 billion. In other words, $72 billion less going into the bank in this latest quarter than prior. because of the banking crisis. Now, what I don't quite understand is that by yesterday afternoon, Tuesday, that had morphed into a much bigger $100 billion. No one can tell me why that is, but it did. And that caused the stock to be halted because it ended the day yesterday down 50%. That's a huge fall. And now, this morning, Wednesday, it's down another 20%. And I think we are, frankly, seeing the end of First Republic Bank here. I'm going to stick my neck out and say that. They have very limited options. It's all costly for them. They can either sell all or part of the bank, they could be bought by somebody else, or they could hand themselves over to the FDIC, which is the authorities here, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And I think that is probably what's going to happen. And then the question is, will the government preserve the deposits up? This will happen up to $250,000. That's guaranteed. But in the previous two banks that went under, Silvergate and SVB, they guaranteed all the deposits. So will the administration do that? We simply don't know. It is slightly caught between a rock and a hard place, actually, because Biden doesn't want to go down the route of 2008-style bank bailouts, because that would help the shareholders, which he doesn't want to do, though he does want to help the depositors. And the other thing about First Republic, which is becoming clear, is it's a rich person's bank. They've courted very, very wealthy people. And it's widely reported here that they gave Mark Zuckerberg of Meta Platforms a mortgage on a $6 million property for just 1%. That's widely reported, so I think it's okay to say that. So they're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. Obviously, the administration will want to save the bank to try and stop any more issues, but at the same time, they would most likely end up, at the very least, possibly bailing out shareholders and certainly bailing out very, very rich people, which is not what this administration is all about.
And John, you said it was a very busy day on Wall Street. There's also been some big news in the gaming sector.
I know, and this comes from the UK. How about this? The UK hitting Microsoft right where it hurts. And this is something called the Competition and Markets Authority, which I'm sure you're very familiar with in the UK. It's the regulator that looks into these things. Now, in simple terms, Microsoft, which is a major Dow component and also trades at the NASDAQ, wants to take over Activation Blizzard, which trades at the NASDAQ, and this is a games maker, and the games are very well known. Call of Duty, Guitar Hero, Candy Crush, World of Warcraft. It's a $69 billion attempt to take over Activation Blizzard by Microsoft, but now the UK regulator says, no, we're not having it here, and the reason for that is that they think that Microsoft has the tools to run all of these games globally. But if it gets access to the games produced by Activation Blizzard, then it will become too powerful and knock people like Nintendo off the playing surface, as it were. So that's the rule. I mean, you know, if a jurisdiction like the UK is doing this, then the takeover is stymied, I think. The European Union has to make the same decision next week. And here in America, the Federal Trade Commission is not happy about the takeover either, for all the same reasons. Microsoft says it'll appeal, but that appeal may well fall on deaf ears.
And John, we've had some earnings out, haven't we? Run us through them.
Yes, well, Microsoft was one of them last night. Microsoft and Google, very, very strong earnings, pretty good all round. Microsoft shares up 4%, Alphabet up 4% yesterday. The problem with Microsoft was their cloud division, Azure, only saw growth of 27%, and it's been capable of much, much, much more than that. As for Alphabet, well, the cloud business was in line. YouTube was slightly better. They're also doing a $70 billion share buyback. AI, despite what I said yesterday, did not really feature at all. And I think that's because we're at such early stages of artificial intelligence and chat GBTs and things like that. We've just had Boeing with a huge loss, $425 million. And in 4 hours, Meta Platforms, Mark Zuckerberg again, will give us their latest look at what's going on at Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram, or Insta, as we trendy young things here on Wall Street like to call it.
I don't know how to follow that. John, thank you very much. Our correspondent John Terrett in New York.
Just laugh, I think, is the best thing. Electric car sales broke new records in 2022, and that growth looks set to continue. In its annual Global Electric Vehicle Outlook, the International Energy Agency says EVs are bringing about an historic transformation of the car manufacturing industry. Global sales exceeded 10 million last year, meaning that around 14% of all new cars sold in 2022 were electric. Now compare that to 2 years before, when it was just 5%. China was the biggest market for electric cars in 2022, accounting for around 60% of sales worldwide. In fact, China has already exceeded its 2025 target for new energy vehicle sales. There were also promising signs for emerging EV markets. 2022 was a year of growth in India, Thailand and Indonesia, with sales tripling compared with 2021. EV sales are expected to continue strongly throughout 2023, with the International Energy Agency predicting 14 million vehicles will be sold worldwide. That would be a year-on-year increase of around 35%. And the trends in EV growth are set to have significant implications, of course, for global oil demand. Replacing internal combustion engines with electric ones will avoid the need for at least 5 million barrels of oil a day by the year 2030. Well, let's talk now to Jim Holder, the editorial director of What Car and Autocar. Jim, good to see you. Well, 1 in 5 cars sold in 2023 will be electric then. Well, it's a revolution, Jim, but an uneven one, with new petrol and diesel still in the mix, clearly, for new buyers.
Yeah, absolutely. It's crucial to remember that petrol is still taking the majority of new car sales at the moment. But that is changing, and as you say, it's changing at a different pace around the world. China is absolutely leading this charge, and there has been a notable softening of demand for electric vehicles in Europe and in the USA, particularly in light of the cost of living crisis over here. And that, I think, is where the risk really lies. Can we keep up the momentum? And can that sort of hockey stick graph of growth of EV uptake be maintained in the face of all these challenges?
Tesla has been aggressively cutting prices. Now a number of other car brands are either joining or considering joining the price war. What's that going to do? How's that going to affect the wider industry?
Yeah, I think it's the worst case scenario for the wider industry. I think Tesla and Elon Musk are playing a dangerous but canny game. The risk to them is that they undermine both the brand strength of Tesla and their residual values of their vehicles by keeping on taking price off the new vehicles. But for the other manufacturers, they have to respond. They have to find ways of discounting their vehicles to make them look competitive against Tesla. And of course, that's going to erode profit margins. And those profit margins are what are meant to be paying for the transition to electric vehicles. So that push down by Tesla really is putting the pressure on the mainstream car makers, where once it was just challenging the luxury and premium ones.
I take your point about this being bad news if you've already been stuck with buying an overpriced Tesla, but presumably this is rather good news for people who haven't quite bought an EV yet.
Absolutely. EVs are typically around 10 to 20% more expensive than the equivalent combustion engine car today, but this pressure is only going to help the consumer. We foresee through our data that in the second half of this year, there are going to be some significant discounts available on EVs, and the manufacturers are going to be under enormous pressure. They have quotas in some markets that they have to reach for electric vehicle sales, and they are only going to be able to achieve that by offering consumers better offers. So absolutely, it could become more of a buyer's market in very short order.
The United States and the EU have both announced their plans to develop clean energy and increase their investment in green tech and green industries. Is that going to have a spillover effect into EVs and the EV industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it already is. I think at the core of this point is the fact that EVs are only as clean as the energy that's put into them, and the way that energy is created is critical, of course, to that equation. But I think also you can see among some of these incentives and these bills, particularly in the United States, that there are incentives to buy electric vehicles, particularly home-built ones, becoming available, and they run to thousands of dollars in that case. So, of course, again, that's going to help people make the switch and make the transition, and will swing purchase decisions.
Jim, good to see you. Thanks for coming on the programme again. Jim Holder, editorial director of What Car and Autocar.
And while the car market moves to lower carbon models, the European Commission has also moved to make its airlines greener. The European Union has agreed to set new rules requiring airlines to use more sustainable fuels. As part of that agreement, airlines will have to use increasing amounts of sustainable aviation fuel from 2025. Puma has reported rising sales due to bumper demand for sneakers, trainers in Europe and its first growth in China in 2 years. Revenue climbed 14% to $2.4 billion in the first quarter, slightly ahead of analyst estimates. But the German sportswear brand cautioned that profit margins will remain under pressure from higher costs. British American Tobacco has been fined more than $600 million for selling cigarettes to the DPRK, which violates US sanctions. The US Justice Department said the company's been doing so for years. It's the most severe action ever taken by US authorities against a company for breaking its sanctions. US toy maker Mattel has unveiled a new Barbie doll representing people with Down syndrome. Toy giants tried to make the range more diverse after criticism that traditional Barbie did not represent real women. In recent years, Mattel has created Barbie dolls with a hearing aid, a prosthetic limb, a wheelchair and in different skin tones. The company says Barbie now has 175 different looks.
Heathrow was the busiest airport in Europe in the first quarter of this year, but the high traffic volume did not put the company back into the black. Our correspondent Li Juanhua has been following the story.
Yes, Jamie, Heathrow started the year with quite a strong first quarter, but it has not returned to profit, with adjusted losses of over $170 million in the first 3 months of the year. And looking at passenger numbers, the airport handled nearly 17 million passengers in the first quarter of the year. That is more than 74% higher than the same period last year, when COVID travel restrictions were still in place across much of the world. And Q1 airports revenues came in at slightly over $1 billion. This is about 58% higher than the same period in 2022, which was just over $640 million. When looking at Heathrow's annual earnings over the past 4 years, we can see its yearly revenue took a deep dive in 2020 and 2021, which was around $1.5 billion. However, last year, it saw its revenue jump to $3.6 billion, almost as high as in 2019. So, does this mean the aviation sector is recovering to pre-pandemic levels? Paul Charles is Chief Executive of travel consultancy, the PC Agency.
It's a very attractive airport for us as consumers to fly out of. And, of course, the airlines themselves want to base themselves at Heathrow. It's still the UK's major hub airport. It enables a lot of connecting traffic. So despite a cost of living crisis, it's still able to generate lots of revenues, plenty of turnover, because it's a very attractively located airport within the UK.
And Paul, despite the improvement in passenger numbers, the airport has reported adjusted losses of around $170 million in the first quarter. How so?
Heathrow is still adjusting from that pandemic period through to post-pandemic. So it's seeing the passenger numbers return quite healthily now. It's back up to nearly 98% of what it had before the pandemic. But of course, the first quarter period is generally a quieter period in the airport's diary. Its busiest period is the summer, the UK's summer, and that's when it will generate most of its profits. But things are getting better despite the losses. It's seeing more passengers come through its doors and choose to fly from Heathrow. It's also still generating plenty of money from the high passenger charges levied by the UK regulators, and those passenger charges will be coming down, but it's still making the most of them. And of course, don't forget, Heathrow makes money from the shops that are within the airport itself. And with more passengers coming back, more people are buying things in the shops before they fly from Heathrow.
And China has recently reopened its border back in January, and now for passengers who are going to China, they no longer need COVID tests. So how do you think that the reopening of the border of China could help with the recovery of the aviation sector in the UK?
It's really good that China has reopened its borders and is enabling the Chinese to travel outbound again, as well, of course, as many tourists coming back into China. And if you look at the flight schedules, the flights planned for later this year, it's clear that the airlines are voting with their feet. They're putting back the schedules, they're putting back the flights that they had pre-COVID back into the schedules, and you can expect a lot of tourists, both out of China and into China, to be travelling later this year.
The airports will become really hectic in summer. Now back to you.
Yeah, we hope so. Yeah, Joanna, thank you very much indeed for that. You can get highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN's Storyboard email newsletter. Sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, reforming the pharmaceutical industry. The European Commission unveils its plan to cut prices and boost availability.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen acts.
The difference is in the detail, the background,
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Ukrainian President Zelensky describes his phone call with China's President Xi Jinping as long and meaningful and has appointed a new ambassador to Beijing.
Our other headlines: thousands of people are evacuated from Sudan, where an uneasy ceasefire seems to be holding.
And First Republic Bank shares plunge after it reports massive fund outflows. The bank says it's looking at options.
The European Commission has unveiled its plan to overhaul its pharmaceutical legislation, aiming to cut prices and boost availability.
The reform aims to create a single market for medicines and will reduce the number of years of market exclusivity from 10 to 8 years, despite fierce opposition from the industry. The plan, which needs to be approved by the European Parliament, is expected to result in the most significant changes in 2 decades in how the EU regulates its drugs industry.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels. Alex, what more do we know about this reform plan?
Well, Jamie, it was described by Vice President Margaritis Schinas when he was announcing the plan as epic and enormous. And it is the biggest reform in the pharmaceutical industry the European Union has done in 20 years. And that key, as you said, is to ensure equal access across the bloc. To give you a sense, patients in Poland or in Romania, members of the EU, of course, will have to wait 2 years longer than patients in Germany to get access to new medications. The Health Commissioner also announcing the plan earlier today, saying that big Western European countries have access to 90% of newly authorized medicine. And if you look at some of the smaller Eastern European or Central and Eastern European members of the EU, they will only have access to 10% of new medicines. And that really is not that they're trying to crack here. Now, how are they going to do that? As you said, reduction of the data protection time for new medicine. So if a new medicine is made available, it will go down to 6 years before another company can see that data and start working on building a generic alternative, a new alternative, and then the market obviously has more competition and therefore more supply for those countries. Now, one thing that companies can do, pharmaceutical companies can do to extend that protection time all the way up to 12 years in total maximum, but they can add 2 years by saying that the medicine will be accessible to all EU member states. That's one way of making sure that, look, if you want us to protect your medicines under EU law, we will do so if you provide every EU state with those medicines. So it's a very, very big push and a very big change to how pharmaceuticals are regulated in the European Union. Another aspect of this plan is addressing antibiotic resistance. This is something that will be done at a member state level, but the EU is recommending a 20% drop in the use of antibiotics. So a very big, bold policy from the EU. There were concerns it was going to be watered down, but not the case today.
Alex, fierce opposition from the pharmaceutical industry to this plan. I mean, will this be seen as the EU holding firm against pressure from the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, absolutely. That's how those European officials are trying to present it, making it very clear that they work for European citizens. They are very concerned about the unequal level of access to medicines across the bloc, and they say it's just unacceptable. And as we said, this was the biggest reform in 20 years. And so there's a bit of a sense behind the scenes of, look, the pharmaceutical industry has had 20 years to fix this problem. Why has this never been sorted before? So the EU is stepping in now to do so. There was concern, as I said, this announcement was delayed by months because of the EU's scheduling issues, according to officials. But now it's been announced. There were fears that that delay might be a sign of watering down, of caving to the pressure of the pharmaceutical industry. Now, the Director General of the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries said that this approach to new legislation is actually going to penalise innovation and will stop companies from producing new medicines in Europe. Very strong pushback from the Health Commissioner, the EU Health Commissioner, saying the EU will continue to have the most competitive and industry-friendly incentive system in the world. But it's very interesting to see how this will develop. Of course, it'll have to go to the European Council. A lot of big pharmaceutical industry companies in Belgium, in Germany, in France, and those very influential, very powerful Western European member states. So we'll see how the debate rumbles on, but certainly a big first move by the European Commission.
Alex, thanks for that. Our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels.
Turkey's President Erdogan has cancelled some of his election campaign rallies due to illness. Erdogan cut short a live television interview after suffering from a sudden upset stomach. He was scheduled to hold events in 3 different cities on Wednesday. The 69-year-old has been in power since 2003 and is expected to face a tough re-election battle in the general election next month.
The Taliban has killed the Islamic State leader who spearheaded the 2021 suicide bombing at Kabul airport. The Pentagon confirmed the death of the unnamed figure, saying he was killed during a battle this month in Afghanistan. The Kabul airport bombing took place in 2021 during the chaotic US withdrawal from Afghanistan, leaving 170 Afghans and 13 US personnel dead.
Singapore has executed a man for smuggling cannabis in 2013. The sentence has drawn international criticism, including from the United Nations Human Rights Office. Singapore has the world's strictest laws on drug trafficking, which carry the death penalty.
Japan's space startup company iSpace has confirmed its mission to make the world's first commercial landing on the moon has failed. The lander lost communication during the last phase of landing. iSpace said the lander likely made what is called a hard landing on the moon's surface. The Hokuto spacecraft was sent to space by SpaceX's Falcon rocket last December. It carried the UAE's first moon rover and a Japanese robot to collect samples from the lunar surface.
The death toll among followers of a Kenyan religious cult who were told they would go to heaven if they starved themselves has risen to 90.
The authorities have unearthed more graves at the ranch where the church is based, and the search operation has now been expanded. Our correspondent, Wilkester Nabwa, reports.
On Tuesday, exhumation sites deep in Shakahola Forest in Kenya's coastal region were cordoned off. The death toll attributed to a Kenyan religious group suspected to be a cult continued to rise as more bodies were discovered in the shallow graves. The discovery brought to light shocking discoveries for neighbors and relatives. Crispus Karisa Jeffa, a resident of Shakahola, says his sister took her children and joined the church. Her family tried to rescue her from the group, but she went back to it.
They came and took my sister Salama. They took her with her children from here, Shakahola. When we went to fetch her and got her back home, we were surprised that she escaped again and returned. We wondered what kind of power they used.
They say the church raised eyebrows with its practices through the years.
According to my observation, they have two groups inside their church. One group is like security. The other group is people who have been indoctrinated. We are not allowed inside there. When we lose livestock and go there looking, we see some people wielding machetes. I think it's the army. They are ready to ask very hot questions and instruct us to get out of there.
While authorities recovered bodies from the shallow graves, a small number of the group's members were found alive and emaciated, but later died. By Tuesday, at least 34 adherents had been rescued alive. The group's leader, Paul Mackenzie, was arrested on April 14th following a tip-off. At least 14 other members are also in custody, according to the police. But the Kenya Red Cross reports that more than 200 people are still missing. It has set up a tracing and counseling desk at a local hospital. The Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions says preliminary investigations show that the suspects might have committed crimes including murder, radicalization, and threatening public safety. As the exhumation continued, Kenya's Interior Minister Kithure Kindiki suggested that the group's leader should spend the rest of his life in prison.
The government of Kenya will do whatever it takes to make sure that we convict Mr. Mackenzie and all those who helped him perpetrate his heinous crimes.
But locals and civil society groups say more should have been done sooner. At the forest, the exhumation exercise continues as authorities search for more bodies and answers. Wilkester Nabwa, CGTN.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, getting your dream to the big screen. How the Beijing International Film Festival is helping young directors.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw. The cleanup operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country. There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew. And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Israelis are celebrating the country's 75th anniversary.
Political tensions, though, are casting a long shadow over the celebrations this year. CGTN's correspondent Stephanie Fried reports.
It's an annual tradition. Israeli Air Force fighter jets flying in formation every Independence Day. This year was no exception. Barbecue smoke billowing from family grills at public parks, beachfronts, and apartment balcony porches was also no exception this Independence Day. But this year, revelers intermingled with tens of thousands of protesters who have been hitting Israel's streets for the past 4 months. As fireworks signaled the start of Israel's 75th year of statehood, protesters signaled their unwillingness to accept government plans for reconfiguring the country's legal system. The redo will cancel out judicial checks and balances.
I feel there was like a deep sadness, and people didn't want to celebrate as much.
A majority of Israelis celebrate this year's Independence Day with a mixture of pride and consternation. Pride for what the country has achieved over a 75-year period, concern over growing rifts within society, threatening to cancel out those accomplishments. Stephanie Fried, CGTN, Tel Aviv.
Brazil's President Lula da Silva has met Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez in Madrid and called for an end to the war in Ukraine.
Lula also wants to push for a deal between the South American trade bloc Mercosur and the European Union as Spain takes over the EU presidency. Our correspondent Ken Brown reports.
This visit marks the beginning of a new era, said an animated Lula, who has been on a worldwide tour of affirmation that Brazil is ready to play an important role on the international stage once more. Lula and Spain Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez spoke at a joint press conference where the Brazilian leader was asked again about his stance on the Ukraine conflict. This comes after controversy around previous statements that the US and Europe should stop supplying arms which would prolong the war. The US response: stop parroting Russian propaganda.
I'm not the one who has to decide who owns Crimea. When they sit down to negotiate, they will have to address that matter and any other. I'm not the one that has to debate about it. It's Russia and Ukraine. First of all, they have to stop this war, then start negotiating. They will both think they are right and that their arguments are better, but right now people is dying, so they need to stop hostilities to reach agreement.
Lula's Europe visit has a strong economic dimension too. 4 years ago, the European Union signed an ambitious trade agreement with Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay and Uruguay, known as the Mercosur bloc. That was halted over the EU's environmental concerns on Brazil's deforestation. Lula has now committed to zero deforestation. The stalled EU-Mercosur deal was top of the agenda for both Sanchez and Lula today. The EU is Brazil's second largest trading partner, and this deal would ease barriers even further. The two leaders both confidently stated that a deal is within sight and should be reached in the second half of this year, coinciding with when Spain takes over the rotating EU presidency. EU exports to the Mercosur bloc were worth close to $50 billion back in 2020, with new agreements on lower and non-tariff trade, including more joint ventures, that looks set to increase.
Brazil will hold the presidency of Mercosur at the same time that Spain will hold that of the EU. That coincidence means a great opportunity to get closer to specific agreements between the EU and Mercosur. Spain wants this really important economic agreement to happen, and we're happy that President Lula and his government supports it.
If signed, both sides hope that it can boost job creation, sustainable development and stronger economic ties, in what many hope is a new era of cooperation and collaboration between Europe and South America. Ken Brown, CGTN, Madrid.
It's curtain up for the Beijing International Film Festival, and it's not just a platform for the big names in movies. One of the main features is Project Pitches.
It helps young and upcoming directors secure investment in their films. Our correspondent Wang Se-wen reports.
Xiong Ziyue has been working in the film industry for more than 5 years. She studied film in university, and her dreams of being a director have never changed. But it's not an easy path, especially for young people.
Ultimately, the market and the industry don't have a high level of trust in new directors. And young directors' professional skills only stay in theory. And using new directors will increase the risk of producers.
She said more opportunities are what young directors need the most.
It doesn't need to be a high investment production, but even a short film or drama is a good option for young directors to gain experience and show their talent, realize their value.
Talent and good content have been the focus of this year's Beijing International Film Festival. More supporting measures have been put in place to help those wanting to break into the film industry, such as young directors and those with the potential to stand out. The Project Peaches segment is helping to discover filmmakers with potential, providing a platform for investment, production, marketing, and so on.
The future of film must be these young professionals. I hope they can have more opportunities, whether from these film and television companies, directors, screenwriters, and so on, so that they can show their talent on stage. What new stories can be born from the perspective of these young people?
Judges say only good stories matter. Winning projects will be selected and eventually turned into films. Wang Sun, CGTN, Beijing.
Giant panda Yaya is returning to China after living in Memphis Zoo in the United States for the last 20 years. In February, Chinese veterinary surgeons visited Memphis to check on Yaya's health. They said a skin disease had caused her to lose fur, but otherwise she had a good appetite and stable weight. Many in Memphis say they can't bear to see her go.
And it's so heartbreaking. We grew up with her.
Are you from?
I'm from here. I'm from South Haven. I came when they brought them.
20 years ago?
20 years ago, I was here to greet them. A great experience. We got to know them. We got to enjoy them. We got to learn about them and everything, and that's the best thing we could have done.
I have been here with her about 30 to 40 days already. I'm very sad because she will leave soon, but I'm also very excited because she can finally return home to her motherland.
The headlines again. Ukrainian President Zelensky describes his phone call with China's President Xi Jinping as long and meaningful and has appointed a new ambassador to Beijing.
Our other headlines: thousands of people have been evacuated from Sudan, where an uneasy ceasefire seems to be holding.
And First Republic Bank shares plunge after it reports massive fund outflows. The bank says it's looking at options.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
There's more on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
And you can go to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team here in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.